Hey, everybody. Welcome to Deep Dive with Shane and Amy. I'm Shane.
I'm Amy.
This week, we're going to talk about being on the frontier, boldness, and Amy.
Fun.
All right.
So our scripture this week comes to us from Isaiah chapter 60, verses 1 through 9. Arise, shine. Your light has come. The Lord's glory has shone upon you. Though darkness covers the earth and gloom the nations, the Lord will shine upon you. God's glory will appear over you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to your dawning radiance. Lift up your eyes and look around. They are all gathered. They have come to you. Your sons will come from far away, and your daughters on caregivers' hips. Then you will see and be radiant. Your heart will tremble and open wide, because the sea's abundance will be turned over to you. The nation's wealth will come to you. Countless camels will cover your land, young camels from Midian and Ephah. They will all come from Sheba, carrying gold and incense, proclaiming the Lord's praises. All Kedar's sheep will be gathered for you. Rams from Nebaioth will be your offerings. They will be accepted on my altar, and I will glorify my splendid house. Who are these who fly like a cloud, like doves to their shelters? I'm the hope of the coastlands. Ships from Tarshish are in the lead to bring your children from afar, their silver and gold with them, for the name of the Lord your God and for the Holy One of Israel, who has glorified you.
I can't hear anyone say Tarshish anymore.
Tarshish.
Which, yeah, it's a tongue twister a little bit. I can't hear anyone was saying it without hearing the voice of the VeggieTales people in my head because of the Jonah movie. Oh, he's going to Tarshish or whatever the voice is. I apologize to anyone who had to hear me do that voice, but I can't hear anyone do that without just going into my mind.
It's a hard one. Tarshish.
Yep. Tarshish. Yep.
There's one too many H, maybe. So you started off the sermon this week talking about resolutions and how you don't do them or don't like them, or maybe yours is not to have resolutions.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good way to say it, because I feel like I'm covering every base this year. So I'm like, on one hand, I'm claiming I'm not doing one because I'm terrible at them and I just never see them through. And I think the reason is I always make mine too like big pie in the sky. Like, this is the life-changing year. Eat better, exercise better, great attitude, all that. Like just these unaccomplishable goals is I think what I normally do. And so I just gave up on that a year ago. But I do like making unhealthy resolutions. Maybe not unhealthy, but I'll say that so I made one this year and it's almost been like a joke between my wife and I. It's like, I resolved this year to play more video games. And the reason is, it's just because it's for me. I'll enjoy it. I don't play a lot of video games. It's not like we have an Xbox or PlayStation at home. I bought the new Star Wars game and I'm playing it. And so I'm giving myself permission to enjoy that because I really do enjoy it. And so I've never wasted a lot of time on video games, but I do enjoy them. And so that type of resolution, that's fine. Sure. Or like if you wanted to make a resolution to eat more candy, I'm all favor of that. But all these like resolutions that are just a new you instantaneously, man, that does not work for my personality. And I don't think it works for a lot of personalities because I think the overall like fail rate of most it's got to be like 99%.
Yeah, and a lot of times like it's by like February, right? That very beginning of February, and it's well, that never happened.
So you put me on the hot seat. How about you? Do you do resolutions?
I do not care for resolutions.
You don't? Okay.
No, I do not do that either. I don't even have a fun one.
Oh, okay.
I think mine may actually be I don't do resolutions.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a perfectly acceptable one.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as using the end of the year for introspection and thinking about who you want to be, by all means do it.
Yeah. You can dream about those things without saying I will accomplish these.
Yes. Yeah. And I think you can even set them. I don't like seeing people, and I say this like an act of self-parenting here. I don't like seeing people make these goals and then fail and beat themselves up.
Right. Absolutely.
It's just, I don't know. We're human beings. We're destined for failure, and shouldn't beat ourselves up about that to some degree.
Well, and I think you run the risk. Actually, we're talking a lot about the resolutions, but I think you're running the risk too of maybe giving up too soon on something that you should be working on. If you start to feel like that's slipping away and like, oh, well, that's done for this year. I'll try again next year.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting component too to relate it back to our faith. Is faith should be always characterized as a practice, something that's never perfected. Apologies to the Methodist out there who think it's possible to perfect. Those of you that are remaining that think it is possible to perfect, but as a practice, it certainly has a communal element. And so, this is why I, not only to glorify God, but this is why I participate in that weekly rhythm of coming back to worship as Presbyterians in a Reformed tradition. That's why it's so important for us to confess every week, because we realize all these ways that we've fallen short, we've missed the mark, and realize that we need, both correction from that process, but also the experience of a larger community to share their experiences. And so a resolution doesn't really, unless it's a resolution maybe somebody's done in a small group or something like that, or an accountability group. But I think that's why I don't do it.
Get it. So you took the opportunity with the sermon to be able to share some data that's come out recently, kind of looking back over the last decade. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'll link to this down in the show notes because I'm not going to be able to pull up all the specifics right here, but it's relating to this Pew study that looked at the last decade in American and religion, and in particular Christianity. And I think it's all numbers people have heard before. I mean, everybody's realized the cultural trend of, less people being frequent church tenders, less people actually identifying Christian. It's kind of been a thing for the last couple of years to talk about the rise of the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S, not the N-U-N-S, the people that claim no religious affiliation. It's interesting that always comes alongside of the studies that talk about millennials' relationship to spirituality and being a high spirituality generation, but not necessarily identifying anything in particular. But I think everyone, in some ways, we might have gotten used to those statistics. I've used that phrase in the sermon where I said, accustomed to death. It's actually in a book I've read recently that used that term. And I think that's really what's implied in the prophet here, that he's dealing with the people that are accustomed to failure and disillusionment. But I think if you step back and when you're able to look at it, what has happened in a decade to American Christianity, it's shocking. I think it's a 12 to 13 point decline in people who regularly attend church, a corresponding 12 to 13 point decline in people who even identify as Christians. And so if you actually put that in the context of the total number of Christians, it's 18.5% decline in the church in 10 years. Yeah. A rough estimate, 1 in 5 people just left and never came back. And most of those people are people that are Gen X or younger. Because the oldest generation, boomers and the silent generation, largely have held pretty strong in their attendance, at upper 80% for our builder generation, silent generation. And so to me, that should be setting off alarm bells in the church about something is going on here that can't just be explained by Protestant low birth rate.
Right.
Because it's actually people leaving the church altogether. I reference in our denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA, we're losing about, I believe, 40,000 people a year.
That's correct.
But we're losing those because there are members that are dying. And so we're not even offsetting those. I mean, not even making a dent in those losses by, making new disciples, baptisms, births, all those sort of things. And so it's just shocking. Maybe it's going to plateau out. I don't know. But either way, it says something is going on. And to me, the church needs to examine, what she's doing about this. We should always be seeking to make disciples, but it's almost like we just forgot about that for a generation.
So that's really interesting because I think there's maybe a combination of we've heard these numbers so many times that we're a little bit numb with them. But I wonder, too, if it's not the sort of thing where we don't want to face them. In some ways that that we can't bear to look at that because we feel like we don't know what to do. Yeah. And I feel like in the sermon, you kind of started to cast a vision for kind of some possibilities of how we can interact with culture and the life of the church and people in community currently.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot about church revitalization. In particular, I read a book recently just called I Refuse to Serve a Dying Church. And he uses this metaphor in there, the difference between frontier Christianity versus fortress Christianity. And I think what he's really attacking in that concept is this idea of the institutionalization of the church, where the church once was an organization that went and reached into sort of unreached areas. Well, within the West, we've reached all those areas, and then when we reached those areas, we built buildings. We built really big buildings. Here we are. We're sitting in an enormous building, and so it has this institutional effect where we think participating in church sometimes is just serving the institution. And so instead of an institution being oriented toward making disciples, making connections, welcoming, broadening the kingdom of God, it becomes about self-service, serving. The church point of the church is to serve the members. Somebody would often use the analogy of calling a church a country club in that regard. I pay my tithe, therefore I should get the rewards, which is, whatever it is, pastoral visitations, whatnot, all those sorts of things, a place of privilege within the church. And I think it's understandable how we get to that point. But I think this is also an opportunity for the modern church to examine, her behaviors, to say, we should really be more embodying that frontier attitude. Even though we have this building here, it might actually serve us some good to think like we don't have this building here. Or if you've ever known anyone that's had a church that's caught on fire and they've lost their building, it has completely changed their orientation. We have a church very close to us that did this. They lost their church to a fire, 10, 15 years ago, and it has sort of changed their orientation toward their neighborhood. I don't know. Sometimes I've almost thought of churches like, if you have a Windows computer you've just left on for weeks and all of a sudden it can't print and things don't work. What's the answer? Reboot that thing. And I think that's sometimes that the mental exercise we need to do within churches is to try to let the institutional stuff that really doesn't matter fall away or examine it. And then go through this process of rebooting, of saying, what do we really, really feel called to do? Who do we feel called to reach? And then marshal our resources that way. Because if we don't, there's just enough stuff going on from, today we were literally exploring a water leak in our building, things like that, while important, will become your number one priority as opposed to making disciples for Jesus Christ. And that's a challenge. Our congregation is not unique in that by any rate. Sure. Every church is facing this one. And so I think that's a great way to think of it. I've heard someone like Brian McLaren describe the church as Fort Church.
Yes.
Our facility can feel like that. We have a large facility that it's in a beautiful location in Metro Nashville, but it's up on a hill and it's a very tall building. And so if you just see us from the street, we look like a fort.
Yeah.
And so that can be used as a metaphor and a physical description. I think we build these institutions, and it's almost like the field of dreams. Build it, and they'll come. And so we just think we'll plant ourselves here, put out a really good sign, and people just flock in because they like us. But those institutional winds have changed. Church people don't have positive affection for the church anymore, and so the job of making disciples means going out, building relationships, speaking the good news, doing the good news, and that's something, unfortunately, we just didn't do a lot of for a while. Yeah. Yeah.
And all of that takes boldness.
Yes, it does. Yeah. I talked about that. I talked in the message about, values. I'm fairly new here. It's been about 7 months. I've been here 7, 8 months, somewhere in there. 7. Yep. 7 months. And people are always asking, what do you think is your value? What's your vision for the church? That's something we're going to build together as a congregation as we move along. But there are things I definitely value. And I think one of those is the day and age of timidity should be past us. When you look at numbers like this in the face, one doesn't just wade back into tackling it. You have to dive into it. And we live in a culture that is so saturated with advertisements, entertainment options, all these things vying for our attention. So to just share the good news in this meek way, just sort of undercuts the radical nature of the good news. If it really, I think I used this frame in the sermon, if it really is something that convicts us, if it really is something we're passionate about, if it really is something that's life-changing, what's the point of sharing it timidly? And so it means we need to be bold, not just for bold's sake, but bold in a lot of different ways of, we're dealing with people that, you go to the movies, it's this enormous sensory, I know people don't go to the movies in the same regard, but a big movie comes out, we're still going to the movies, and it's this big sensory experience, and it's got moving music and lights. People go to concerts. It's the same type of experience. People have their holiday traditions where they go to the places that do the special decorations and all these sorts of things. And if the church doesn't understand that they are in that environment, we're going to fail because we're going to do the most milk toasty, just easy to ignore things. And so that's where I think boldness plays a big role. Boldness also just comes with, frankly, spiritual confidence to share the good news. In the case like our community, we're a more progressive community. We're an open and affirming community that we have people of the LGBT spectrum that come here, are full members, full involved in leadership. And what's the point of being a community that does that doesn't want to actually share that with people? Because we see that as part of the good news, full inclusion of God's kingdom here in this place. And it's being able just to be honest about where we are in that theological spectrum. I think that's really important. To me, the thing that undergirds all this is I just think church should be enjoyable. I use the word fun. Yeah. Here in the Presbyterian Church, we have this, what's the chief end? What's the point of being human and creating God's image? And it's to glorify God and enjoy God forever. I joke that I think we glorify God. We understand that. But we somehow miss the enjoyment part of that. And church has unfortunately become associated with, the slog, the doldrums, the place where you go sit and be quiet for an hour. Everyone rolls their eyes when they think about committee meetings or all sorts of things. I think all these things should be infused with the sense of joy. This is why I value silliness so much. This is why I value humor. This is why I value creativity. I mean, the church should be a place that, people who really loved writing poetry in high school are trying to write poetry now, even though they're not professional poets. The same way for songwriters and musicians, the church should be a place where we get to use the totality of our being to try and worship God in bold ways. And I think fun is sort of, that enjoyment, that sense of joy is the mechanism for making that happen. Experience with that? What do you think?
Oh, I love fun.
You love that's good.
No, I totally agree with everything you're saying, really, because I think for a long time the church just thought, I'm talking capital C church, that if we just do what we've always been doing, but we do it better. Right. If we make it bigger, if we make it shinier, if we make it louder, all of those things, then we'll be able to compete with the movie theaters and all of these things that's going on. And I don't think that's what's called for. And I don't think it's what's going to work either.
Yeah. And that's even a difficult framing of things too, to say, because when we're talking about boldness or fun, we're not talking about competition.
Absolutely.
We're not trying to create this environment where it said, oh, the church does better at movies than the movie theater.
Correct.
That's not what it is. It's just being aware that we exist in an environment where people are conditioned by those experiences. We say we have something different, which is God's presence, the Holy Spirit among us, which allows to liven our hearts and add to this experience and inform it. So I do want to be clear about that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you mentioned in the sermon too, that God is always calling us to new things. So I think that's really important, especially when we think about programs and events and the way we've done things and thinking of the newness that God continues to offer all of us.
Yeah. And that to me really relates back to the formula of change that unfortunately the church has bought into, which is, this is the I guess it's more an equation. It's one, what we think God is wanting us to do minus the things we think people are going to get upset about. And that ends up equaling what we end up doing. And that's such a frustrating, we all do it. I mean, everyone does it. Anyone that's led anything in the church. And so I'm not just talking about pastors or elders or any of that. I'm saying anyone that's led anything in the church. That's the sort of built-in equation that we're doing. Where I think it really breaks down is I try to think of myself as a person that someone's considering in that equation. So they start thinking what I'm going to be offended with. And then they base their decision on what they think God wants to do, but they subtract the thing out of that decision that I think I'm going to be offended with. I think that's offensive. And the reason I think it's offensive is because when you do that equation, they're thinking, I don't have the ability to respond to this godly call the way they do. They're like, I don't have the ability to change or see something different. And that might very well be true. But if you rob me of that opportunity, you've robbed me of the opportunity to change. So from a leader, if you're not engaging people in that process, and if you're not pushing those bounds in ways, you are giving people permission to always remain entrenched, and you're giving people permission to not consider the new things God might be calling them to. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think God calls people to new things just because they're new.
Sure. Yeah.
So like, God is not calling us to say, this Bible, let's get a new one. Like, I'm not saying things like that. But what I am saying is I think there's always possibility for growth. Sometimes it's in little subtle ways. And I think now it's time for big, bolder ways. But we have to give people the opportunity and challenge them to be open to God's call in that. People are going to have objections, but there's a difference between a godly objection that just says, I think doing this compromises our ministry, versus the type of objection, well, I have this preference.
Right.
And I think that's a really big challenge, because I'm tired of playing the game. What's the most I can get away with for making the most people happy? Because that again, the audience that we're playing to there is the people that are here. When isn't that the entirety of the issue of the last 10 years plus is that we're only considering the people that are here and not asking the people who are here to consider who's not here. Well, now is the time we have some recommendations or deep dives, things that we think you might enjoy. I'll go first. I always make you go first. I'll go first.
Okay.
Because mine's really simple. I've already mentioned it. It's not that complicated. I resolved to play more video games. I am playing Jedi, Fallen Order, Star Wars. I can't even remember. This is how rare I play games, because I literally don't even know the name. It's something Fallen Order. Jedi, Star Wars, Jedi Knights, Fallen Order. It's very enjoyable. I run around with a lightsaber, and there's these rats that try to attack me, and I hit them with the lightsaber, and I enjoy it. And then my daughter walks in and says, "What are you playing?" And then I have to try to, while I'm playing a game, I have to try to explain the whole mythology of Star Wars to her. So, anyways, I recommend that. It's if you're a gamer, if you enjoy playing video games, it's a pretty fun game that you can play it where you can set it on a setting where you still get through the story, even if you're terrible at the video game. I'm on the one that this is for people who are terrible. This is for people who are great. I'm the one below terrible.
Well, you have the whole year to practice.
Exactly. Yeah.
So mine is a Netflix show this week. It's the show called Messiah. Have you seen this?
I watched part of the first episode, but I was so tired I wasn't able to finish.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
It's definitely not for families. I will say that. But it is really interesting. The idea is that this figure kind of arises in the Middle East, and the show plays out is this a Messiah figure who has come into the world, and kind of how people react to that in very modern day.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand it's not intended to be a specific Jesus analog.
Correct.
Because this is a Messiah belief that comes up in the midst of Islam. But it's more a cult. I think you're right, an interesting understanding of the cultural dynamics of someone who might be perceived as a Messiah.
Mm-hmm. And his role kind of expands even beyond Islam as the show goes on. So I mean, it's very interesting to watch, not based on anything true or any of those things. But I think it's kind of just a fun kind of experiment to think about those sorts of things.
Here's a fun fact about that show that I know. The two people who created the show have created two other shows. You want to guess what they are?
Oh, my goodness. I have no idea.
Survivor and Touched by an Angel. Oh. Yeah, so
interesting.
You got that. I heard someone give a review, said it was like Homeland, but with Jesus.
That's perfect.
Is that good? Okay.
That is perfect. That's exactly what it is.
You encouraged me. I think I might give another, I tried to watch it last Sunday night when I was exhausted. So I'm going to give it another go.
Give it a go.
All the show notes, everything we talked about, they're down there in the show notes. Make sure to subscribe, share all these things. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, in the YouTube, subscribe to our channel, all those sort of things. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on Deep Dive.